Thank you so much. So we'll just go right into the first panel. Unfortunately, Professor Darryl couldn't join us for a family emergency. However, he did send a recording, which we will play. So the first panel is the export of Zionist identity. Professor Alejandro Paz will, from the Department of Anthropology, will moderate, and Liron Mor from the University of California, Irvine, will be speaking.
Thank you, everyone. It's great to see everyone here. Yeah. I know we've all been suffering, so this is a great space, as our speakers noted, to think together and be together. So it's my privilege today to introduce Liron Mor, who I've just met just now. Liron is Associate Professor of Comparative Lit and Director of Critical Theory at the University of California, Irvine. Liron's book, Conflicts, the Poetics and Politics of Palestine-Israel, was published by Fordham University Press in January 2024. Her interdisciplinary research spans the fields of critical and political theory, Hebrew and Arabic literatures, translation and visual studies, and critiques of law, conflict, and colonialism. Mor is particularly interested in local conceptualizations of political conditions and modes of resistance as expressed in the cultures of Palestine-Israel. She's currently working on a second book project that examines intentionality as a rhetorical, political, and legal technology of dispossession and racialization as experienced by both Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews. So Liron, I'm supposed to keep time, so I'll let you know at about 25 minutes. I'll wave my hand or something.
Can I speak from here? Would that be okay? Yeah, okay. Okay. Can you hear now? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, it's always a surprise to hear that I'm working on this second project, you know. There's no time to work on anything at the moment. I wanted to, like everyone else, thank the organizers. It's amazing to be here, and it's an honor to discuss what I consider the most pressing topic of our time. And even though I'm very grateful to be here, I also feel a little bit uncomfortable about it for several reasons. Some of them more obvious than others, but perhaps at the top of the list is the contrast between this beautiful room in the law school with its promise of this, you know, pleasant intellectual exchange, and the unprecedented, world-shattering, scaleless death, destruction, starvation in Gaza and in the West Bank and Lebanon as well. And I truly wish that I could do more than point out this unbearable contrast. But, you know, at this point, there is no words. I don't know what to say anymore. A second discomfort that I'm feeling is far less grave. It has to do with with being the first to give a paper at this illustrious conference. And I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but sometimes when one finds themselves as the first person, you know, in this position, it's hard to not second guess oneself and think, you know, did I truly understand the brief? Am I going to talk about whatever it is everyone else understood that we will be talking about? I'm not sure, but I hope so. And this sense of, you know, not fully comprehending the context, if you allow me a personal anecdote, also characterized my first years in North America. I came here in 2009, right after that financial crisis in 2000. You know, there have been so many crises since that it's kind of like you have to name them. And I remember that for my first few years in pro-Palestine organizing spaces, this was before they were all called SJPs. It was a time of pre-standardization. But in those spaces, I was very confused about the way others were using the term anti-Zionist. Believe it or not, but it took me a minute to understand that in the US, anti-Zionist didn't mean anyone who opposes Zionism, as I thought it meant. It actually meant Jews who oppose Zionism, or at least it did in 2010. And it was surprising to realize that this term anti-Zionist hinged on being Jewish, and hence on an implied assumption that Jews are Zionists until proven otherwise, until they come to reject that Zionism in an oppositional, counter, or anti-move. Anti-Zionism, as it is commonly used in the US, is thus a dialectical concept par excellence. It is an opposition to Zionism that assumes a prior state of Zionism, an opposition that is still tied at its source, at its point zero, to Zionism. It also, of course, implicitly accepts the Zionist credo that Zionism does indeed represent all Jews and acts in their name. So today I would like to propose two objections to this perception of anti-Zionism and ipso facto of Zionism. First, I would like to put forward the idea that Zionism is not Jewish. Stressing the imperial and settler colonial aspects of Zionism, I will discuss it as a Christian and specifically British project. Zionism is thus not only a non-Jewish project, but also an anti-Jewish project. It is anti-Jewish in the dialectical sense of the word anti I mentioned before. It is an oppositional permutation of Jewishness, whatever that means, that supersedes it, yet remains, despite its best efforts, tied to it at its source. But Zionism is also anti-Jewish in quite the literal sense. It is formulated by non-Jews to the detriment of Jews and to the detriment of Semites and Orientals more broadly, and I really hope I'll have time to say something about this. Second, and perhaps more importantly, I would like to broaden the definition of anti-Zionism so that it does not rely on being Jewish. To get away from the dialectics, perhaps a better term for this would be counter-Zionism. I don't know, I don't like neologisms, but maybe that would work. And by this I mean a principled objection to Zionism that does not depend on one's identity. To demonstrate this, and this is yet another turn of the dialectical screw, to demonstrate this, I propose looking at a case that is too often left out of discussions of anti-Zionism in its normative sense, and that's the case of Arab Jews. Unlike some famous European critics of Zionism who often objected to Zionism's vision of an exclusionary Jewish state in Palestine based on and in their Jewishness, many Jewish Arab critics of Zionism, both before and after 1948, have formulated their objections and warning with no recourse to their Jewish identity or culture. Theirs was a political rather than an ethical position, prioritizing ideas of the good political life, including revolutionary ideas, over ethical imperatives such as, never again, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to start with the side of anti-Jewish Zionism. During the current war in Gaza, many cases of Israeli looting have been reported and even widely broadcasted. I'm sure you've seen some of those videos. Think of Israeli soldiers posting to social media photos and videos of themselves posing in stolen women lingerie or riding a child's tricycle. We could also think of those more clandestine Israeli soldiers who have stolen cash as well as various household and pantry items collected for their monetary worth, but also for their exotic authenticity and as war trophies. But I'm also thinking here of a larger scale form of looting or value extraction that took place during this war. Far surpassing these food soldiers, the biggest profits are being made by Israeli weapon manufacturers, by all those white-collar, high-tech startups that develop warfare and surveillance technologies, as well as those black box predictive AI systems that have been first tested during the current offensive on Gaza. Thank you. Sorry, I lost that have been first tested during the current offensive on Gaza, and whose prices are now considerably marked up due to their battle-tested status. So the U.S. media sometimes mentions this idea that, Israel's economy is being affected by the war, but no one ever mentions the fact that the Israeli military, technological, industrial complex is booming, that the proceeds of that industry have shot up this past year, despite predictions that it will go down given the failure of those tools during October 7th. That Israel is profiting from a war that it itself is waging, that it alone has the power to end, is mind-boggling. So is the fact that those individuals and interest groups who are the greatest beneficiaries of this war constitute the very same class calling the shots in the Israeli army, politics, and society. Yet the extractive nature of what by now is known as a forever war seems less surprising when we consider the longer history of Zionism, that non-Jewish or even anti-Jewish history of Zionism. Shifting the focus in this way helps stress the imperial and settler colonial aspect of Zionism at the expense of the conflict between two national movements framework. And it's important to me to clarify that my motivation here is not moral. It is not about assigning blame or relieving it by transferring responsibility for Zionism to Europe. Instead, my motivation is diagnostic. I believe that this prism allows us to better see certain aspects of this war and of Zionism or the Zionist idea more broadly. As Edward Said famously argued, so I was once blamed by a Jewish studies scholar that what I do is Saidianism, so I decided to double down. So, it's all Said, the entire paper, just so you're clear. Anyways, as Edward Said famously argued, Orientalism and Orientalists regard the cultures of the East as inert, silent matter that awaits redemption by Western interpretation and improvement. Within this schema, claims Said, Zionism occupies a special place, one which allows Zionist politicians and writers, quote, to interpret Palestine and its realities to the West in terms that the West could understand and easily accept, employing a method that allowed Zionism always to seem both involved in and superior to the native realities of Middle Eastern existence, end quote. And I will say that Said constantly describes this in terms of translating the East for the West. But what exactly is this special place that made Zionism such a handy mediator and translator? One possible answer is the frontier. Not fully subjected to either legal system, the frontier is a contested space whose spatial and temporal indeterminacy is generative for speculative production of value. Because the Jewish question and the Eastern questions were historically linked, the idea of a Jewish state that would serve as a frontier in the Arab world had been suggested by Christian Europeans long before it was championed by Jewish Zionists. Sent to the brink of Western civilization as a vanguard intended to confront the Orient in the Orient, Zionism became, like translation often does, both a bridge and a border, both inside and outside the Orient it translates. So on the one hand, Zionism was regarded in the European imagination as a mediating bridge, as a conduit, a translator of the East to and for the West. Lord Shaftesbury, there were many, so the seventh Earl of Shaftesbury, to be exact, was perhaps the first major politician to propose a plan for the resettlement of Jews in Palestine intended to increase British extraction through more efficient, more Jewish cultivation of the land. In January 1839, so this is 1839, this is before Jewish Zionism took off, he wrote, quote, "The soil and climate of Palestine are singularly adapted to the growth of produce required for the exigencies of Great Britain. Capital and skill are alone required." End quote. Capital, he hazarded, would be attracted to Palestine by the stationing of British officers whose presence alone would guarantee the security of property required for capital. The fulfillment of skills would be outsourced to Jews who, barred from agricultural work in other countries, would be encouraged by British protection to, quote, "return in yet greater numbers and become once more the husbandmen of Judea and Galilee," end quote. So the task was regarded as undesired, and the undesired Jews were regarded as best suited for the task, precisely because they were perceived as partially Eastern. So their Oriental nature kind of best prepared them to take on this task, but they were also because they better understood the Eastern mind, but they also understood as only partially Oriental because, and this is another quotation of Said, they emancipated themselves from the worst Eastern excesses, end quotation. So this should already give you a sense of what I mean when I say that the OG Zionism was not only non, but also anti-Jewish. The assimilation of Jews as an extending other of Europe passed through the logic of the rampart of the West in the East, using Jews as a kind of good Semite or good Oriental to oppress and extract value from the bad Semite or bad Oriental, a division that is productive for Europe and that has long characterized the British method of divide and rule. And if I had more time, I would have loved to talk about how this same kind of good Semite, bad Semite is being played at the moment in public discourse in the U.S. with all of these invocation of anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, a bridge. On the other hand, the Jewish state in the eastern frontier of the West was envisioned not only as a translation, but also as a protective border or a fortress. And we all, we're all familiar with Herzl's famous framing of this. We will be a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization that will forever keep in contact with Europe, which would have to guarantee our own existence. So Zionism, for its part, eagerly adopted this framework and the role that was assigned to it, seeing it as a two-way transaction whereby the Jewish state would serve as an eastern bastion of Europe, which Europe in turn would commit itself to protecting. And Vladimir Jabotinsky had similar ideas. I can't quote quite a lot of people, but I think we get the point. My next example was Herzl's Alt-Neuland, but I'm going to try to compress it in the interest of time so that I can get to the second part of my my talk. Herzl's Alt-Neuland, which was published in 1902, is really a great example of this kind of frontier extraction. It is not addressed to Jews. It is obviously not addressed to Palestinians either. It is addressed solely to European powers. It's a text for Europeans. And one of the ways we can see that is that the two main protagonists who arrive in Palestine twice to discover what has been done of it are both Europeans. One of them is Jewish, one of them is not. And everyone in Palestine is explaining all of the development and the new technological advancement to them in European terms that they can understand, and also Herzl presumed European readers could understand. So if they talk about trains, the comparison is to trains in Germany. If they talk about the new mutualistic order in this new society, then the comparison is, some other European example. So the point is quite literally to translate the East for the West, and this is not new. It follows in the steps of 19th century travelogues, British and French, to Palestine. Muhammad Ali Khalidi argues similarly that Herzl's audience was not Jewish readers, and he writes that Herzl strives to convince Europeans, quote, to conceive of the Jewish state as a testing ground for various experimental schemes in which they themselves had been interested. And here we get to a different meaning of the frontier. So if spatially it is a border and a bridge, then temporally, as the brink or the coming future, it is also a laboratory. And much has been written about the contemporary use of Palestine and especially of Gaza as an experimental space in which warfare and warehousing technologies are tested before being exported elsewhere. And my panel mate, who is not here, Darryl, has written about it as well. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that. But I wanted to kind of flag it as another effect of this translative frontier, translative border. To sum up this part of my talk, I wanted to mention that one of the more problematic self-images through which Israel conceptualizes its relationship to the Middle East is that of the villa in the jungle. This phrase was coined in 1996 by the then Israeli Foreign Minister, Ehud Barak, and it has been repeatedly recycled ever since by various Israeli politicians. Barak's image was fittingly first expressed in English when he was addressing American Zionists in St. Louis. This metaphor, which still resonates with especially liberal Zionists today, paints Israel as a cloistered, lawful, luxurious, civilized, and securitized Western bubble in the midst of an exotic, lawless, savage, hostile, wild forest. Throughout its existence, however, Israel has not only habitually invaded what it calls a jungle and attempted to rearrange its geopolitics through militaristic, political, and economic pressures. It also constantly extracted value from this oriental jungle. So perhaps a more accurate colonial self-image for the Zionist relationship to the Middle East might be that of a safari rather than a villa. And, I'm using both ironically because neither of these make any sense. But I'm talking about their own self-image. So Zionism is not completely isolated from the East, nor does it simply turn its back on it. Instead, like a colonial safari, Zionism, and today Israel, translates and commodifies the East for the West while serving as a distancing barrier. And this is kind of the main point I wanted to get to. And this is because a lot of scholars tend to emphasize the ideological support that Zionism drew from the notion of return to a historical or promised land. But I am to clarify that another no less important pillar of the Zionist justificatory system was that of serving as a mediating frontier for the West. That is, as that border bridge that allows for more efficient extraction while simultaneously distancing the East. Both Easts, both Jews and Arabs in that case. This was a common self-perception amongst Zionists in the early 20th century. It could be gleaned, for instance, from a 1926 public essay published by Jabotinsky, arguing that Zionists were going to the land of Israel, first and foremost, for their national comfort, and secondly, as Nordau said, in order to expand the borders of Europe all the way to the Euphrates. That is, in order to thoroughly and fundamentally cleanse the land of Israel, and as much as its Jewishness, past and future, is concerned, of every trace of the Oriental soul. End quote. And this anti-East cleansing campaign, as Jabotinsky clarified, pertained to the Eastern traditions of habits of Jews as well, from which they should be weaned. And now I'm going to transition to the second part of my talk about non-Jewish anti-Zionism. I hope I'm doing okay on time.
18 minutes.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God, I have like...
We're at 18 minutes.
Oh, okay.
So 12 minutes left.
Okay. Forget that. I couldn't say anything. Okay. So moving on. So after pushing against the framework that limits Zionism to Jews, I want to move on to question a complementary framework that defines anti-Zionism in Jewish terms, and along the way essentializes the meaning of what it is to be a Jew, and often, when doing that, excludes Arab Jews. In insisting that there is a Jewish culture or nation beyond religious practices, broadly construed, this framework replicates the Zionist attempt to dictate a single meaning of Jewishness. If we truly accept diasporic logic, then we must let go of any idea of a Jewish nation, of a unified meaning of Jewishness, and instead truly commit to its scattering. This goal drives me to consider some of the historical counter-Zionist positions of Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews, and I'm going to use the term Mizrahi even though at the time they were called Sephardi, who wouldn't recognize Yiddishkeit as their national culture, even with qualifications. And as you might gather, I'm talking here about Daniel Boyarin's work, which I admire, but I also disagree with him on this particular definition of Jewishness, or Jewish nation, which becomes universal, and whose content, the humor, the suffering, is unrecognizable to my own family, for instance, coming from the Arab and Muslim world. Okay, so I want to look at what Mizrahi Jews are saying. So if Jewishness is not shared, other than a set of rites and text, if there is no alternative cohesive definition of a Jewish culture, then speaking of a non-Jewish counter-Zionism, even when speaking of the criticism of Zionism by Jews, makes sense for that reason alone. But it also makes sense because Jewish Arabs objected to Zionism and imperialism not in the name of their Jewish identity and not as a dialectical reaction to Zionism. Rather, they did so due to a cause, a value, communism, Arab nationalism, or pan-Arabism, sometimes Arab culture, anti-colonialism, their own traumatic experiences of displacement, etc., etc. I would like to foreground three examples. It's going to be two, just to be realistic. But idealistically, I would have foregrounded three examples from generations 0, 1, and 2. That is, from the time before the creation of the State of Israel, 1 or 0, from the generation of those who were displaced by Israel right after the Nakba, which would be generation 1, and from the generation of their children born in Israel and no longer having any unmediated relation to their own Arab past, and that would have been generation 2. I should acknowledge from the start that these counter-Zionist positions are basically a thing of the past. They're virtually non-existent at the moment in the third and fourth generation. And I would be happy to talk to you more during the Q&A about why that is, if you're interested. This shift, however, does not preclude us from looking into these historical examples to uncover their understudied and underutilized counter-Zionist modes of thinking and resisting. And I do think there is something specific that they're bringing up, and it's worth looking at. Okay, so I'm going to start with generation 0, and my first example is that of the Jewish Palestinian Chaim Ben Kiki, born in 1887 in Tiberias to a Sephardi family. And he was an autodidact who taught himself a bunch of languages, and he published articles in both the Hebrew and Arabic press, which is, kind of cool. His writing, particularly his 1920s writing, betray a clear anti-colonial stance that explicitly objects to the colonization of Palestine by European Zionists. There were other Jewish Palestinians who expressed counter-Zionist views, especially in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, such as Eliashar, the Muyals, but quite a few of them have gradually adopted an Ahdawi worldview that praised the value of modernization for both Arabs and Jews in Palestine. And this valorization of modernization kind of tipped them over into Zionism, if only because it meant the imposition of European values on the land. Even though, their modes were kind of a confused form of Zionism, but also Arab nationalism. Ben Kiki, by contrast, remained steadfast in refusing the logic of improvement, no modernization. He conceptualized his objections by distinguishing between a Western or settler Zionism, which comes in to alter the culture and its politics and impose European systems, and an Eastern or native Zionism, which is Zionism only to the extent that it accepts Jewish immigration to our land. This is how he talks about it. Yet it does so under the condition that Jews who migrate to Palestine must integrate themselves into the local Arab culture and its political system. So in his words, quote, "When the new settler comes to the land, he does not come to accommodate and adjust. The precise opposite is the case. He comes to make others adapt to him. He doesn't come to learn, but to teach," end quote. And this might be a dig at one particular teacher called Epstein. So Ben Kiki is a great example because he is in dialogue with Epstein. So his piece of writing from Ben Kiki's piece of writing from 1921 on the question of all questions concerning the settling of the land is a response to a piece with a nearly identical title by the Ashkenazi critic of Zionism, Yitzhak Epstein. A few years later, in 1925, Epstein will go on to co-found Brit Shalom with all those very famous German Jewish critics of Zionism. He's thus a classic example of the Ashkenazi immanent critique of Zionism. So this contrast is quite useful for us. Epstein, in this and in his earlier pieces, kind of mansplained to other Zionists that, guess what? The land of Palestine is not empty. Palestinians are not loving the situation whereby, you're dispossessing them with like this land purchase project that's not working very well, he's telling people. But what he's not telling them, so he's urging them to reach out to Palestinians for reconciliation, and to stop this MO by which they are negotiating with the British and the Ottoman empires over the heads of Palestinians. But he doesn't say how. This is the most amazing thing. Nowhere does he specify how exactly Zionists should form good neighborly relations with Palestinians and gain their consent for Zionism, which is something he believes in, nor does he attend to the question whether such process would involve giving up Jewish supremacy or European values. In fact, he advocates for modernization. If there's any solution to the Arab question in his writing, is that greater modernization, better education, and better healthcare will bring Palestinians into these better neighborly relations. Ben Kiki, by contrast, is clear. He employs arguments that align with what today would be called anti-colonial or decolonial critique, and his diagnostic tools are not that far off from the later prism of settler colonialism. According to Ben Kiki, Epstein, I keep changing the language in which I pronounce this name, failed to see that, quote, his proposals contradicted the foundation of the Zionist project in Palestine, whose main goal was to create an isolated society separated from the Arabs, that villa in the jungle that I mentioned earlier. Ben Kiki, by contrast, argued, quote, Central to any solution was a change in national Zionist ideology itself, from an isolated European approach to one that seeks to integrate into local space as it is. While Zionists of his time, end quote, while Zionists of his time criticized assimilation, for they were still having that European conversation about assimilation, for Ben-Kiki, this was the only acceptable form of Zionism or of Jewish immigration to Palestine. I don't know if is it still Zionism if it does not come to change or alter, if people don't come to change or alter the land. I wanted to let Ben-Kiki speak in his own words with two examples, and I hope that I make it through. So he writes, Epstein is furious that our diplomatic work is rotten, yet the actual fact is that our culture is rotten. The root of evil is our work that produced the rupture with the Arabs, is that we deserted our Oriental culture, whose basis is Arab culture, and brought in Western culture in its place. This new culture is completely opposed to the culture and mind of the people of this country. It turns us into a foreign alien element that threatens to destroy the foundation of their Arab culture. It is that which makes them angry. The principal condition for being good neighbors, as well as for mutual trust, before we come to propose to the Arab people what Epstein wants to offer them, is one, return to our Oriental culture. He also writes, the failure lies in the fact that the settlers did not bring the Jew, as he is, to reside in the country, but placed him within the purgatory of exile and redemption, and stuffed him with spiritual phrases about Judaism and its lofty and exalted ideas. These foggy ideas are the burden that the new settler has to bear. When we come here, we do not want just to live in the country, cultivate its land, and be present in it. No, we want to carry out an entire national program so that all the Jews and all the nations of the world can see the new well-rounded Jew who is complete in body and spirit and whose soul is not torn, end quote. And this is amazing. Ben-Kiki, precursor of Professor Daniel Boyarin, making the point that, you know, the exilic Jew is trying to extricate himself of the exilic condition by coming to Palestine. Okay, I will have to drop my other example, which were the author and journalist and translator Shimon Balas and the author Ronit Matalon, each of them of his own generation. And I'll sum up by saying that all three of them seem to advance integration, the tearing down of the wall of that villa in the jungle. They insist, first of all, that this is not a jungle, and second, that isolation has to end. And in that sense, you know, it's a very common definition of decolonization. Give up the colonial system and the European values that you're bringing with you. You're welcome to migrate. People are welcome to migrate. They just cannot impose a whole other form. So in that sense, it's amazing to see that in 1921 being already displayed in this way. And what I want to highlight is that this criticism is not inspired by Ben-Kiki or the others' Judaism. They also seem to advance something that is the opposite of diaspora. They want Jews who are so often seen in the European imagination as placeless wanderers to find a place and integrate into it instead of remaining detached as Jews. And what they all insist on is precisely this Arabic culture. And it goes between those three examples, the insistence on Arabic culture or Oriental culture, they call it different things, goes through a certain mutation where Ben-Kiki, I've told you about, Balas uses the form of Arabic literature, specifically of Ghassan Kanafani, whose work he has studied and translated in his own writing, to basically say, I too am part of this culture and it's being stripped away from me. So he's also marking the moment in which this culture is being taken away from him, whereby Matalon, writing in the 80s, for her, that process is already complete. She was born after her family has migrated to Israel. And what she's lamenting is the fact that she no longer has that connection to that culture. And that blocks her from being able to see not only her own family's past, but also Palestinians. So she was the Haaretz correspondent for the West Bank and Gaza, and was very vocal in her criticism of what was going there, specifically during the First Intifada. And some of her literary writing is about Gaza, in which she's trying to see, to understand, and what stands in her way is the absence of a culture that has been taken away from her. Thank you.
Yeah.
Going to be screened? What are we?
Are we doing questions at the end, right?
I think at the end.
Yeah, okay.
So, like I said, unfortunately, Professor Darryl couldn't join us, but he sent a recording from the underground, which I'll play. He's just on time. He's 30 minutes, right? Try, don't make too much noise so we can hear it. And then we'll have some discussion, right? We have a mic and we'll do all that. And so hopefully this works.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good morning, all. Salutations to the people of southwestern Palestine, first of all, from Beit Hanun to Gaza to Rafah, struggling in the face of a genocidal onslaught. Thank you also to Asmat al-Halabi and Max Weiss for convening this important conversation, one that I am so very sorry to be missing in person. Please accept this sorry excuse for a budget podcast episode instead. And also, I just want to note a slightly updated title of the paper from what's in the program. So the title is actually Zionism Through Diasporic Eyes, a View from the Other Both. Going to beg your indulgence to present a few very preliminary thoughts about a particular strand of anti-Zionism that I think is under-articulated, but not insignificant. In this respect, I'm going to necessarily question the premise of this workshop, asking what is at stake in the definite article in the title of this event. Can there be, and should there be, an anti-Zionist idea as opposed to many? Or better yet, what is at stake in how we array different notions of anti-Zionism in relation to one another? I'd like to situate my analysis here between two poles, or perhaps between two caricatures of anti-Zionism. The first is the anti-Zionism of the native. It rejects Zionism because Zionism requires dispossession of the indigenous people of Palestine. This anti-Zionism celebrates rootedness, love of land, as-samud. This critique has a simplicity and a purity that forgoes much need for analysis of the specifics of Zionism. So we often hear this line, that we don't care about the identity of our oppressors. If they were Germans, if they were Martians, we would be anti-German, we would be anti-Martian, etc., etc. The second strand of anti-Zionism that's quite common is one that rejects territorial nationalism in favor of celebrating diasporic and specifically Jewish diasporic existence. This is one of the more common varieties of Jewish anti-Zionism. The danger of this critique, of course, is solipsism, Zionism as bad for the Jews. So put another way, we have an anti-Zionism that celebrates autochthony and another that stands for cosmopolitanism. This is just some basic coordinates I'm trying to map here. The alternative that I'm trying to explore is also a diasporic perspective, but it's a different one. And I've been thinking about it more because something curious has happened to me in the past year. For the first time, I've been invited to speak about Palestine by Asian American student groups. Now, for nearly 25 years, I've been thinking and organizing, writing, and speaking about Palestine while being Asian American, but never really as an Asian American. I've always had an acute sense of being racialized as other than white, other than Jewish, other than Arab, other than Muslim. But that is not quite the same thing as identifying a positive content that one can label as Asian American. Anyway, I'm not going to bore you today with my own personal psychodrama about the relationship between my identity and my politics. Instead, I will try to reflect on and expand my own anti-Zionism through thinking about the vicissitudes of Asian American politics and the apparent impossibility of such a category. One hypothesis here is that Anti-Zionism informed by an Asian American politics cannot be based in analogy. We are not akin to Palestinians facing colonial dispossession, nor, I think, is it particularly useful for us to see ourselves in the mold of diasporic Jews as fellow model minorities who should be, quote, questioning our privilege. Instead, disjunctures and analogical interruptions, I think, are where insight lies. Thinking with different models of diaspora in mind reveals that the problem of Zionism needs to be understood as a project that conjoins both a project of racial supremacy in Palestine as well as a project of racial exceptionalism in the diaspora, especially in the United States. I'll unpack these claims a little bit through some commentary on 3 texts by diasporic Asian authors and their unexplicated relationships with Zionism. So part 1. There may be more Asian Americans in solidarity with Palestine than ever before, but whether that makes for something that we can identify as Asian American solidarity is far from certain. Let me be clear. There is a baseline human solidarity that anyone can have with a people fighting colonialism, such as the Palestinians. Under the right conditions, this basic principle is sufficient to activate significant forms of action. It's entirely possible that the apparent growth in solidarity with Palestine among Asian Americans as of late is best understood in these terms. If so, that may be okay, but then we aren't really talking about a specifically Asian American form or theory of solidarity, but rather we are talking about people in solidarity who happen to be Asian American, which again, I don't think is necessarily a huge problem. It is when folks, however, start to theorize the specificity of a presumed Asian American solidarity that things get interesting, but also get tricky, precisely because the category of Asian American politics is already so fraught. It is certainly clear that there is a sense of specifically racial belonging emergent among significant numbers of people in the United States who are descended from Asia, and specifically East Asia, but also South Asia to a certain extent. As countless commentators have lamented, Asian Americans are far from a monolith. Indeed, there are significant cleavages, a strikingly bimodal form of class stratification, a persistence of national questions and the contradictions and tensions that come with them, and questions of generational distance from points of arrival and assimilation. In a recent important essay on Asian American political thought in the journal Theory and Event, Fred Lee and Kevin Pham, quote, wager that Asian Americans exist politically, hence think politically, unquote. Sure enough, but the terms of how they do so remain inchoate. They go on to write that, quote, as for the what and how Asian Americans think politically, Asian American political thought coheres more around characteristic questions than it does around distinctive analytics, none of which are distinctively Asian American, unquote. So where does this leave us? It is here that we very quickly run into the limits of neoliberal models of multiracial and multicultural inclusion and the academic theories subtended by them. In the academic field of Asian American studies, there has been a focus on a shared experience of imperialism. We are nearly 20 years past Sunaina Mayra's and Majid Shahada's piece in the Journal of Asian American Studies making this argument that Arab American studies and Asian American studies are tied by shared experiences of U.S. imperialism. This approach made significant headway in the professional academic field, so with the Association of Asian American Studies being an early endorser of the academic boycott of Israeli academic institutions. More recently, the association refused a grant from the Asian American Foundation, a relatively new anti-hate rather than anti-racist organization, and one that is tightly aligned with the Anti-Defamation League. The problem, of course, is that the claim of shared experiences of imperialism is both true and utterly generic insofar as pretty much everyone on the planet has been affected in one way or another by U.S. imperialism. Asian American studies as a professional academic formation is full of denunciations of model minority myths and rejections of carceral liberalism, which is great as far as it goes. But there is not as much work I'm aware of on how to build anti-imperialism into an Asian American political praxis, let alone a mass politics. In the face of class aspirations, diverse national questions in the Asian continent, and the lingering specter of anti-communism, to say nothing of the geopolitical emergence of Chinese global power in particular, The relevance of anti-imperialism as an analytic requires a different kind of explication, one grounded in immediate material contexts. It's necessary work, but it's also very challenging, and I'm far from the only person who has recognized this, and I don't claim to have any great ideas for advancing it. But anyway, back to the subject at hand. To illustrate the gap in these conversations with one example, I'm going to turn to the celebrated novelist and Asian American studies scholar Viet Thanh Nguyen, who published an essay in The Nation magazine with the title, Palestine is in Asia, an Asian American argument for solidarity. Nguyen is someone who has, quite admirably, leveraged his cultural capital to support Palestine. He was canceled from speaking at 92Y, a major cultural institution in New York, over his pro-Palestinian stances. The ensuing backlash included other speakers publicly breaking with 92Y, including Saidiya Hartman, Dion Brand, and Christina Sharp. As one of the many fronts in the ongoing wars of position in cultural institutions, this was an important moment of polarization. But despite the title of Nguyen's essay, it's difficult to discern in it a political argument for a specifically Asian American form of solidarity with Palestine. Note that Nguyen is Vietnamese American, and there is a very rich history of joint struggle against imperialism between the Vietnamese and Palestinian national liberation struggles that he could have drawn upon, but he did not, because he is trying to articulate a racial theory of solidarity anchored in Asian America, rather than a nationalist one linking Vietnam and Palestine. So what is left? As indicated in the headline, Nguyen insists that, quote, Palestine is in Asia, unquote. Asserting a geographical commonplace is, for me, not the most reassuring starting point, given the absence of a clear racial politics uniting even South Asian and East Asian communities, the two largest demographic segments of Asian America. Nguyen goes on to remind readers of the debt that the field of Asian American studies owes to Orientalism, the book authored by the great Palestinian polymath Edward Said. But how these sorts of citational debts translate into a political praxis or political orientation or political theory is less than clear. Without any mooring in material conditions or any other kind of political analysis, Nguyen leaves us with an exhortation to radical solidarity. Yet, strikingly, the examples he invokes of radical solidarity are the Israeli novelist Amos Oz and the South African novelist Nadine Gordimer, both of whom happen to have been ardent Zionists. Now, as mentioned earlier, Nguyen is someone who has good politics, as the saying goes, and the stances he has taken and the way he has leveraged his cultural capital are probably more important and more helpful than any specific form of analysis he might be offering. Yet, to invoke Amos Oz and Nadine Gordimer as models for solidarity with Palestine is a stark example of, as stark example as any, of how the American studies / ethnic studies space can produce a kind of solidarity based on a decontextualized interchangeability and fungibility of oppressions. As our host, Esmat al-Halabi, has observed, quote, while Palestinian activism continues to be criminalized on college campuses and in state legislatures, in certain academic and cultural spaces, Palestine is cool. Losing land and lives every day, Palestinians have gained citations, unquote. Palestine may be in Asia, and Asian Americans may come to recognize Palestinians as fellow Asians, but where that ultimately gets us is not very clear to me. We are back to the question most powerfully posed by the cultural critic Andrea Long Chu, not the question of does Asian America exist, but rather, do we want to be Asian Americans? And I would add, if so, what does that mean and on what terms? The answers to these questions, of course, will be arrived at through struggle and experimentation, mostly by people younger than myself. So I can leave it open while merely noting that in those journeys, Palestine may increasingly serve as both provocation and cipher. Okay, part 2. In our search for a specifically Asian American politics of solidarity with Palestine, or specifically Asian American anti-Zionism, I think it would help to turn to a more materially grounded account of Asian American racialization. In this respect, I can think of no better starting point than Aiko Day's path-breaking book, Alien Capital, Asian Racialization and the Logic of Settler Colonial Capitalism. Day goes back to the 19th century and the debates over Chinese railway workers and the Chinese Exclusion Acts. She argues that in the logics of U.S. racial capitalism, Asian labor is figured as a kind of, quote, alien capital. Asian labor is the already racialized personification of abstract labor time in the capitalist mode of production. Now, the crass version of this idea is the stereotype of the Asian worker as the industrious, indefatigable coolie or drone. This gives rise to what Day calls a romantic anti-capitalism that valorizes decommodified sociality, but within a specific racial imaginary based on whiteness. This is the tradition of right-wing economic populism, whose critique of capitalism is determined within racial, and here specifically anti-Asian, coordinates. One of the virtues of Day's thesis is how remarkably well it holds up even in very, very different contexts of class formation, including class formation of post-1965 Asian American immigration. The personification of abstract labor time applies to the high-tech worker or scientist as well as to the railway laborer, although one could pose significant questions about how the account should necessarily change when taking class formation into account. What I want to draw attention here to, however, is that Day's argument is powered through analogy. This is basically the thesis sentence of her book. Quote, "In the manner that Jews came to personify processes internal to finance capital under National Socialism, I argue that the Asian subject in North America personifies abstract processes of value formation anchored by labor," unquote. So here we kind of have the opposite of the situation with Wynne. Instead of an invitation to native anti-Zionism through analogy with Palestinians, Day's work presents a possible portal to diasporic anti-Zionism through analogy with diasporic Jews. She even titles the introduction of her book The New Jews, and begins from the discourse that emerged after 1965 of Asian Americans as, quote, the new Jews or good immigrant capital. More to the point, Day's theorization of racial capitalism here is explicitly indebted to the work of the Marxist theorist Moshe Postone and his influential work on anti-Semitism under the Nazi regime. What Day does not mention, however, is that Postone was also a committed Zionist. Again, as with Wynne, I'm pointing this out not in the spirit of a call-out. Right, in the years after the publication of her book, Day has publicly made her opposition to Zionism quite clear. What I would like to do here, however, is to lean into this engagement between Aiko Day's work and that of Moshe Postone by thinking with Zionism and anti-Zionism. Because revisiting Day's analysis with Zionism in mind pulls the Asian-Jewish parallelism apart. For while both diasporic groups may bear certain sociological similarities and social proximity, especially in intermarriage, the coordinates of their racialization are actually quite different. And that difference is all about the geopolitics of imperialism. The U.S. didn't have, just of course as a reminder, the U.S. didn't have formal overseas colonies for most of the 19th century that would have provided a source of circular migration for so-called free labor, i.e. non-white labor extracted through a wage relation. China was one of the few non-Western states in the world system at the time that A, had a labor surplus to export, B, enjoyed formal independence and international legal personality, which made it possible to develop a framework for migration and deportation, or accepting deportees, I should say, and C, was nonetheless weak enough to accept unequal terms by treaty that made the export of labor a necessity and that allowed this kind of differential regime. More broadly, the East Asian region, of course, is where since the 20th century, the few states powerful enough to challenge Western hegemony have emerged, presenting a specifically racialized form of civilizational threat. First Japan in the 20th century, and now in more recent years, China. Anti-Asian racism has always been connected to anxieties over geopolitics. In other words, it is worth noting that the role of hyper-exploitable alien capital that Day describes is how Asians are racialized when the U.S. racial regime is in a good mood. How it operates in a bad mood is an entirely different story, of course. In the period of neoliberal peace that enmeshed the U.S. and Chinese political economies in recent decades, the diaspora might have seemed like a bridge and the form of cosmopolitanism that was appealing. As tensions, however, have grown, so have discourses of racialized threat, And Asian American communities, Chinese American, but also Asian Americans more broadly, have also become hostages to deepening antagonism. And the we here, of course, is slippery because racialization unfolds in tension with the national question. The U.S.-China relationship suffers. It's non-Chinese Asians who are also affected, even if many of them may be invested in that same geopolitical antagonism. By the same token, war with Japan in the mid-20th century led to the internment of Japanese Americans, but it also paved the way for canceling the Chinese Exclusion Acts and permitting the naturalization of Chinese people as citizens of the United States. And these are some of the contradictions that I think we have to sort of sit with and think through. All of this, of course, is in stark contrast with the racial geopolitics of Zionism. After the 1967 war, Israel demonstrated its indispensability to U.S. imperialism. The close overlap of interests between the two states opened political space in the United States for Jews of European origin to assimilate into whiteness while embracing ethnic particularity all at once. To be sure, this process of assimilation occurred in tandem with the large-scale entry of American Jews into the middle class. But the value of Eiko Day's analysis lies precisely in how it goes beyond a straightforward class analysis, surfacing, quote, what we might call the music of settler colonialism. It is from the past, but never stops playing, unquote. For Asian Americans and for Jews in pre-war Europe, class ascendancy did not alleviate racial antagonisms, but rather intensified them precisely because of the geopolitics of imperialism. But in contrast, under the conditions of U.S. Zionist alignment, the old anti-Semitic canard of dual loyalty has largely become irrelevant. If anything, it has given way to dual privilege. To take one example, the Washington Post recently reported that there are more than 20,000 American Jews serving in the Israeli military, twice as many as in the U.S. armed forces. In other words, American Jews are less than 1% of the U.S. military, but potentially more than 10% of the Israeli military. This is not evidence of an inherent disloyalty to the United States, as the anti-Semitic narrative would have it. Rather, what calls for interrogation is the fact that the U.S. racial regime has far more investment in celebrating the participation of its Jewish citizens in a foreign state's militarism than even in its own. Contrast this with Asian Americans, for whom dual loyalty suspicion is completely normalized, with those of Chinese origin being the most numerous group to be denied security clearances. Now, how Zionism as a racial formation positions Jews with citizenship in both Israel and the U.S. as embodiments of strategic alignment, they are seen as super citizens of both countries, or rather living embodiments of the special relationship. Sorry, that's the term I should have used. From another perspective, of course, we can think of them as dual colonizers, participating in two different kinds of settler racial regimes, albeit positioned differently within them. For white American Gentiles, the Israeli, of course, is the new frontiersman, a point of identification that gives a new lease on life to the older narratives of manifest destiny. The Jewish subject that is both Israeli and American merely embodies the apotheosis of that continuity. Part 3. So, to recap, an Asian American anti-Zionism does not readily map onto the anti-Zionism of either the native nor that of the cosmopolitan. To continue along this path of thinking otherwise about diaspora, I'm going to turn perhaps to a lesser-known work that inspires the title of my presentation today. Angsang Ho's 2004 article in the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History called Empire Through Diasporic Eyes, A View from the Other Boat. This helped crystallize my thinking about diaspora and empire at a crucial stage of my own journey. I read a draft of this paper after the first year that I lived in Gaza and was trying to work out an orientation toward graduate study. This is not an Asian American text, but it is a diasporic Chinese one, as Angsang hails from Malaysia's Chinese minority. And this is relevant for other reasons I'll get into. Angsang Ho's analytical object in the paper is diaspora. He begins with the archetypal Jewish model of diaspora and then posits, perhaps counterintuitively for some, the British as a different kind of diaspora. The former were a people that were made mobile. The latter became a people forged out of the English, the Welsh, the Scottish, etc. They became a people through mobility as they conquered the world. To put it in slightly different terms, an empire is a diaspora with an army. Ho then uses this setup to talk about the diaspora hailing from the Hadramaut region of southern Yemen that has traveled, proselytized, married, traded, and settled throughout the Indian Ocean and further afield for over 500 years. Ho argues that, like the British, the Hadramis were a people who through their movement became composite, as Hadramis married locals wherever they went and started creolized families. But they did not form an empire. Instead, their diaspora took form as a religious mission, thanks to the prominent role of Islamic religious scholars, especially those claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Hadramis helped spread Islam to Southeast Asia and were disproportionately represented among Islamic religious authorities throughout the Indian Ocean world. It is the combination of religious authority and transnational sociality through kin and trade that makes Hadramis emerge as recurring leaders of anti-Western, pan-Islamic mobilizations at various points over the centuries, most prominently, of course, being Osama bin Laden, who was a Saudi of Hadrami origin. Ho's article does not discuss Zionism or Israel, but his analysis largely starts with the example of Jewish diaspora. Here again, I quote him. 20 years ago, the word diaspora referred to Jews and was spelled with a capital D. The more general meaning is of a people who were originally homogeneous, then became mobile. Today, almost every ethnic group, country, or separatist movement has its diaspora, unquote. So I'd like to see if we can extrapolate some of this analytical framework to thinking about Zionism. And here I'm going to be reading Ho as part of a dialogical process between advisor and student, but also between sons of two different branches of the Chinese diaspora. Ang Seng Ho, hailing from Malaysia, crafted the argument in this article and in this book to present an ecumenical form of Islam to his Malay co-citizens in order to have an alternative vision to the zero-sum racial politics in that country. For myself, born and raised in the United States, I am reading his diasporic form analysis as part of struggling through the contradictions of a collapsing civil order here and all the vicissitudes of assimilation and deracination that I've been alluding to throughout this presentation. So to recap, Ho argues that Jews were once a single people that were dispersed geographically. But maybe we can update this argument by also thinking about the advent of Zionism. Here it would seem that the claim would be that unlike the early Jewish diaspora or the British or Hadrami diasporic models, which are all premised on the idea of dispersal, and of course dispersal is etymologically, in the term diaspora, Zionism is doing something different. Zionism is acting against dispersion. It seeks to concentrate Jews from all over the world into a nation state, namely Israel. Yet, one should not assume from this that ingathering of the exiles is the entire telos of Zionism. Far from it. Instead, it holds out the promise of normalizing the status of the Jewish people within a nation state, and in doing so, Zionism holds considerable appeal to Jews who wish to remain diasporic as well. So even for Zionist Jews who have no intention of relocating there, Israel exists, of course, as a potential safe haven, but also as a point of reference, an old country that provides a sense of rootedness and historical grounding, and of course, a source of vicarious identification that legitimizes their own assimilation in the various countries where they may live. So indeed, if all Jews in the world became Israelis, it would arguably be disastrous for Zionism, given the crucial political and financial support that the diaspora continues to provide. Under Zionism, the institutional form that diaspora takes is not an empire as with the British, nor a religious mission as with the Hadramis. Instead, it is a settler colony, as has been widely remarked, but a settler colony that, in place of having a single mother country, has multiple aunts and uncles serving as benefactors around the world, each married into a different family or plugged into a distinct government or regime, and they have this sort of overlapping kind of network effect. This is why a mere celebration of diasporic cosmopolitan existence over blood and soil nationalism is an insufficient critique of Zionism, to my mind. Instead, we must recognize that Zionism necessarily has two poles, asymmetrical poles. In Palestine, it manifests as a logic of racial supremacy in a regime explicitly devoted to such a principle. In the diaspora, especially the main site of diaspora, the United States, Zionism manifests as a logic not of Jewish supremacy, but of Jewish exceptionalism in a framework of colorblind civic politics. The consolidation of the Zionist project on the ground in Palestine and the consequent strategic alignment between the U.S. and Israeli states gave rise to a situation where Jews of European origin could occupy a unique place in U.S. racial politics, given the concurrent watershed events of both the 1967 war, but also the Black freedom struggle and how it remade the racial grammar of the country's domestic regime. Against this backdrop, Jews of European origin could be anchored in whiteness, but thanks to the monumentalization of the Holocaust, they could also claim the language of minoritized grievance and deploy it against others, including against people of color. This is also why Zionism has been so crucial to maintaining the liberal order and to policing Black and other non-white radicals, especially those with an internationalist orientation. All right, I'm up on time, so I'm going to stop here. I don't know if there is such a thing as a specifically Asian American anti-Zionism, but I do hope that observing Zionism for some of the many different boats that constitute the Asian diaspora can be useful in our endeavor of elaborating ideas of anti-Zionism. Thank you for your time. I'm, again, so sorry that I can't be with you, but I'm really hoping to hear more and to learn more about this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for these two really, really startling and thought-provoking papers. There's a lot that I have questions for both, but I would like to open it up to the audience. I believe there is a mic, over here. So if you raise your hand, I will put you on a speakers list and make sure that you get a chance. And then maybe I'll put myself on the speakers list at some point. Okay, maybe I'll start. Liron, really such an incredible paper. I can't wait to read it and think with it more carefully. One thing that occurred to me, actually, it's kind of there in both papers in a way, is how the state of Israel becomes part of this logic of guaranteeing Jewish whiteness abroad. Your critique of, kind of the Yiddishkeit, Doigkeit, as it's come up in some of the movements that I've been part of, seems to point to that. And also Darryl really put it in extremely useful terms. And by the way, when you talked about the villa in the jungle, you made me think of something that occurs in American politics, including presidents who will talk about Israel as being in a dangerous neighborhood, thereby using, including President Obama, using kind of a racial politics of urban centers in the U.S., a racist analogy to understand the villa in the jungle. So I guess I'm wondering about that. You talked about Alt Neuland speaking to not a Jewish audience and certainly not a Palestinian or Arab audience. I'm wondering how you see these audiences, especially for the three generations that you got to in your second part. What were some of the ways that they were picked up on, if at all, both among Israelis, but also maybe beyond Israelis, Palestinians, and otherwise?
What does the they refer to? What was picked up on?
Oh, their writings, these kind of anti-Zionist positions
That I was talking
that you were talking about.
Oh, they were not.
Yeah.
The short answer is no.
Yeah.
They did not gain any kind of, audience.
Okay.
Definitely not in the U.S. Matterhorn has been translated into English, so that's something. But yeah, I mean, it is a pretty short answer in that sense.
Yeah.
I wish Darryl was here because there were resonances, particularly around the frontier, and but that's there. But I guess, what I was trying to highlight is the complementary image of what Darryl was talking about. So Darryl was talking about white Zionism, or what has become this now. I mean, Zionism is white, but I'm not suggesting there is a non-white Zionism, sorry. But I'm suggesting that maybe at an earlier time it wasn't all white. And he was talking about that, and specifically the connection between what is happening in the U.S. and what is happening in Israel. And I am kind of interested in what has happened elsewhere. I'm sorry, am I too far from the mic? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm more interested in what happened elsewhere, and also what happened in Palestine before Israel was established, and what other pockets of non-European thought exist, again, in Israel and the diaspora, and that diaspora that is not the American diaspora. And so I thought it was very complementary, because Darryl has done the work of pointing out why I even bothered drawing the connection between Zionism and Europe. And so I thought it worked well. But yes, to your question, no, they have not been picked up.
I wanted to make a request or an invitation to Liron specifically. No shade toward Alejandro, but I would have loved to hear the rest of your paper, specifically your discussion of Shimon Balas and Ronit Matalon. So if you'd like to take some of the ample time we have now to give that to us, I would love to hear it. But a question for you to consider that I found really, something you said that I found really intriguing, was your brief reference to the Nahda. And so the question about the relationship between the modernization or the modernizing impulses of the Nahda project, broadly conceived as it relates to late Ottoman Jews, both within the Ottoman world and outside of it. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that. You were saying some intriguingly counterintuitive, given the nature of Nahda scholarship, things about the relationship between Zionism and the Nahda. So an invitation and a question.
So I'll start from the end. This is actually something I've started looking into very recently. So I'm not an expert on it, but I do find that particular period in Palestine for Palestinian Jews kind of fascinating, because so even a lot of the voices that are by now famous in my tiny field for being critical of Zionism in its early stages, like Elias Sharon and the Muyals, whom I've mentioned. They come to have this really bizarre position. They're fully for Arab nationalism, but they're also, so it starts with the Zionism that is solely in the sense of they support Jewish migration, but then they kind of tip over into the modernizing discourse, which they get because it is a cross-Ottoman kind of phenomenon. They're reading about it in Arabic newspapers. It comes from the Arabic. The ideas come from the Arabic press and from conversations, throughout the world. And then they start to believe that those European Jews coming are actually going to be helpful in modernizing Palestine. And so their position, and they still believe in Arab nationalism. This is the amazing thing. So their position becomes this impossible mishmash. And some of them end up being more Zionists than others because of that. But yeah, and modernization also has two different kind of appearances there. One is, kind of more straightforward. The other one is the Levantine model of a merger of East and West, and it becomes even more obvious later with Jacqueline Kahanov, who is Egyptian, and she's kind of like the one who is the most associated with celebrating this notion of an East-West merger, which leads me to Matalon. So Jacqueline Kahanov is Matalon's kind of foremother, and for a while, Jacqueline Kahanov was very much kind of celebrated as this I don't know if anti-Zionist is the alternative, but within the diasporism discourse, she was a marker of Levantinism and post-colonial hybridity, all of that cool stuff. But in her writing about Levantine Egypt, she's often ignoring the fact that Jews in Egypt occupied a particular position, that they were complicit in imperialism, that some of them didn't even speak Arabic at a certain point, that they were so divorced from Arab culture, again, in particular places, not everywhere in Egypt. And then comes Mataron a half generation later, or almost a generation later, and she's criticizing precisely that position. And she is pointing out the complicity of her own family of Jews in Egypt in imperialism. She criticizes them for not knowing Arabic in her literary writing. So I'm just now flattening and simplifying something that is much more complex and interesting. And in that sense, so you get these very different positions. All of them are critical of the state of Israel to some degree or another, but all of that has disappeared and has been flattened out somehow, and has been reduced to, at best, Arab Jews in Israel should be treated better. Like that's the voice that has been taken from Mataron and from Kahana. Belas, he's such an interesting figure. He was born in 1930 in Baghdad and migrated, it was the forced migration of all Iraqi Jews in 1951. He was a communist already in Iraq and then continued that in Israel in a binational communist party. He wrote for the press both in Arabic and Hebrew, but his literature he wrote in Hebrew, counter to Naqash, who was writing exclusively in Arabic. And what really interests me, and I alluded to that, so everyone knows Memi. Yeah, that's the Arab Jew that everybody knows. And he was really into portraits, like portrait of a colonizer, portrait of the colonized, portrait of a Jew, all of those. And all those portraits, I don't know if you've noticed, they're quite abstract. They're like of a figure. Balas is the opposite. He is, every book he wrote is a portrait, but none of them are abstract. They're always about forgotten historical figures that are that fall between the cracks of national identities, and really complicate this whole question of who is Arab and who is a Jew or even Muslim. So I'm going to give a few examples because I find them amazing. So in his novel, and he is another, Behu Khair, he writes a portrait of Ahmed Nissim Sausa, a Jew who converted to Islam, remained in Iraq after the massive departure of Jews in the early 1950s, and strongly opposed Zionism. And that novel also contains another portrait of the figure of the Jewish Iraqi poet Anwar Shaul. The novel solo brings up the portrait of the Egyptian Jew Jacob Sanu, the forefather of Egyptian theater, who was exiled from Egypt in 1878, and then wrote against the British colonial rule in Egypt. And Last Winter from 1984, another novel by Balas, conjures up the portrait of Henry Couriel, the leader of the Communist Party in Egypt, who was banned and eventually exiled to Paris, where he was involved in talks between Israeli communists and Palestinian communists and tried to encourage Israeli support for the liberation in Algeria. So this is very, very different than Memi in that sense. And so he creates this entire gallery of historical figures who are nonetheless fictionalized to some extent, that undermine, entirely the Zionist narrative that everyone wants to come to Israel, that Zionism has saved them from something. It's a whole other set of options for Arab Jews. Stay in Iraq, become a Muslim. So that is kind of amazing. And then what I was most struck about was his novel, Locked Room. It's from 1980. And in this novel, he does something that in our liberal circles today is a cardinal sin. He speaks for a Palestinian, is what he does. He writes a novel in the first person where the narrator, Saeed Abdulrahman, is a Palestinian citizen of Israel who is in exile. And the exile is in Paris, which is the exile that Balas himself experienced. So he's using his life experiences to populate, the life of his figure, and this figure is also a member of the Communist Party, and he has political positions, let's just say, so that's already interesting. But what I found most interesting, and that I mentioned, is that instead of importing Palestinian content into this novel, to create this portrait and to kind of, try to be in solidarity with Palestinians is what we would say today. Instead of importing content, he imports form. So he uses the fragmentary episodic form of Kanafani's novellas, which he edited, and the translation of whom, he edited, and he was very familiar with. That episodic form that Said wrote about in his Arabic prose and prose fiction after 1948. So, and this is how he writes a novel. He writes a novel in the style of Kanafani. And so instead of like putting words into a Palestinian, well, he does put words into a Palestinian slang, but by using Kanafani's form, he's trying to not only give voice to a Palestinian figure, but also claim that he himself is part of the same crisis that the Arab world was going through, and that Kanafani's form supposedly expresses, according to Said, the rupture of the Nakba, but also of hopes for Pan-Arabism. And in that sense, he kind of claims his own place as an Arab who has experienced that rupture. And he's saying that, better understanding or being part of that project is kind of the way forward, rather than, engaging with Zionism in any way, in a sense, right? Like, he's not even criticizing Zionism in that sense. He's doing something entirely different on the formal level. So, yeah, I hope I answered your question. That was very descriptive, but it was fun.
At the back. I think it's that loud. There's a microphone coming for the record.
Also, yeah, we cannot hear.
Thank you so much for an amazing paper. I just have two questions. First, you mentioned why there's no. You mentioned that you can speak more about why there was no anti-Zionism in second and third generation. So I wonder if you can tell us more about that. And also, you mentioned that, which I found very interesting, how the Zionism portrayed the East, or the Orient in this case, as safari, Orientalist jungle, and they were trying to sell it to the West and be this connection. And I see this very obvious in Sinai, and how they marketed Sinai when they occupied it for tourism businesses and so on. So I wonder if you can tell us also more about that.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for that question. So that's fun. I mean, okay, so a lot of my recent work has been about the question of Mizrahi violence and how this animosity came to be, which is very, very visible at the moment. And like others, I claim that it was made in Israel. And specifically, I think there was a structural thing from the start whereby Mizrahim, or Sephardi Jews as they were called before 1948, were brought to Palestine already in 1909 to replace Palestinian labor. The logic was a logic of replacement. So in order not to rely on Palestinian labor, there were clear plans. Zalman Shazar describes them, calls them a satanic plan. There was a plan to import Yemeni Jews from Yemen, bring them to Palestine, keep them in deprived conditions so that, God forbid, they will ask for more money. And they, even though they're not great right now as agricultural workers, they say, and I think it's Rupin who said that, well, you know what? They will fortify, they'll learn how to work with the till and the plow and all of that, and they will come, and here I'm quoting, better contenders for any farming work in Palestine, and they will be able to replace, and they will indeed replace, the Palestinian worker. That is what he's saying in 1909. And this is repeated. So Arab Jews, or Jews of the lands of Islam, were imported to Palestine starting very early to compete with and eventually displace Palestinians in the labor market. Then it becomes also in settlement after 48, when Israel is, looking for greater demographic numbers, but also to hold on to the newly occupied borders. It again turns to Jews of the lands of Islam, imports them in great numbers, and sells them along the frontiers in exactly the same places it just expelled Palestinians from. So it literally physically puts these Arab Jewish bodies where Palestinians were a second ago living in houses that still had the warmth of people's bodies in them. And, I talked about the frontier in a sense, Arab Jews being more Oriental than European Jews become the frontier of the frontier. Like they're kind of, they are literally on the borders doing this work for them. So in labor, in settlement, and now in securitizing in the army too, Arab Jews are kind of at the forefront. And each and every one of those instances, their job is to compete at the very least, or to displace Palestinians. So this is structural. If already in 1909, Arab Jews were meant to replace Palestinians, and if after 1948, they were literally there to prevent Palestinians from returning, their bodies were used in that way, then what kind of hope is there for solidarity? It's a zero-sum game where an adversarial structure was set up by Zionism, by European Zionism from the start. And it only got more and more stark the more Zionism had made Arab Jews, I use that term as a shorthand, I'm sorry, Arab Jews assimilate because, as I've mentioned before, like Zionism did not love the Arab and Oriental cultures of Arab Jews and actively stripped them of them and cut them off from those cultures. So they've literally lost the language capacity to speak to Palestinians who are right there. So the further from 48 we get, the less connection to Arab culture people have, but also the more intense the sense of competition and displacement becomes. And after 67, when Palestinian workers from the West Bank and Gaza come into the Israeli market, people say flooded, like this isn't right enough, and wages are going down. Some Mizrahi Jews took advantage of the situation to become middlemen and contractors. So suddenly their class went up a bit. And so us, got kind of invested in maintaining that class and not falling again to the bottom of the class hierarchy. And so that was yet another motivation to kind of keep this adversarial relation. And finally, there's the fact that even though they were on the frontier and doing all this work and building things, blah, 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 they, unlike Ashkenazi Jews, never got any recognition for it. So there's also the sense that their belonging to the nation, their patriotism is constantly doubted. And so there's the need to vocally perform it by being hateful explicitly of the enemy. So there are so many different layers to this, but I think that the main issue is the structural issue. When you take people and put them in the place of other people, that's just it. That's just it. And from Palestinian perspective, it doesn't matter what Mizrahi Jews will say and how in solidarity they would want to be. Their very existence is at the expense, at the place of Palestinians. And so that's just it. That's just that. There's really not much beyond that. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, right here. Thank you. The microphone's coming right there.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. That was really great. I just wanted to ask, to go back to like the very, very, very first point that you made about just kind of finding what it sounded like some surprise, the way that anti-Zionist in the U.S. meant a specifically Jewish formation. And I'm curious about what that means and whether that's changing even beyond the sort of like historical contours that you're giving it. And have just been thinking about the way that on the one hand, it seems like maybe it signifies a kind of gap between like a kind of like Jewish coded anti-Zionism and a Palestinian or Arab coded Palestine liberation movement, sort of like negative versus positive content or something like that. But then at the same time, how I think that now there's probably people who kind of genuinely understand themselves as supporting Palestinian liberation, but wouldn't be comfortable calling themselves anti-Zionist, even if they don't call themselves a Zionist either. and it feels like it just keeps going around in circles. And yeah, I'm just curious how.
Can you say a bit more about these people who are uncomfortable calling themselves?
I mean, I think they're probably liberal Zionists, but they wouldn't use that term.
Right.
But I think that like there's maybe a little bit of a shift to I guess I just wonder if there's more of those people now who actually do have a connection to Palestinian struggle in some way, some sense of solidarity. They've gone to demos that they wouldn't have gone to in the past, that kind of, whatever it is. It just feels like an interesting gap, I guess, in both directions.
Okay, so my short answer is you tell me. I am not an American, and I'm still baffled by a lot of aspects of, American culture, American activism, campus activism. There's a lot of it that like I'm still confused about. But to try to answer your question, I think the term anti-Zionist is still in use. I think it's still in use more in reference to Jews than anyone else. But other terms such as like pro-Palestinian activism or Palestine support, I don't know. Other terms are just used more often. And I think that a lot of anti-Zionist Jews are just kind of, maybe some of them are liberal Zionists, so it's easier for them to just say they're pro-Palestinian. But I also think it's just kind of, it's just a broader definition, so a lot of people kind of congregate towards that. I would love to hear from you. And I'm not wearing my glasses, but you seem like a young person to me. What is the situation on the ground? Are people not using anti-Zionism? Are they? I don't know.
I kind of want, I don't know. I kind of want to know what everybody else thinks. I mean, I feel like my sense of it is what I already said, but it's kind of a vague observation that has been shifting a little bit.
I think it's a better question for Darryl. I wish he were here. Yeah.
We have a question over there. House for my glasses.
I think we met before.
Did we? I'm so sorry.
I know. I don't remember. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Maybe at lunch?
Maybe at Mesa or I lived in Toronto for a year, actually.
Okay.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about, from my vantage point, I think there are more victims of Zionism and not only Palestinians. Do you think that like Mizrahi Jews feel a sort of estrangement from their own culture or from their culture, from the origins of their culture at present? Yeah.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, please.
Because your question and Allah's question earlier made me think a little bit of Nadim Karkabi's work on and others who've been writing about this kind of renaissance of
Yes.
Being Moroccan, not Arab,
Yes.
or but Moroccan or being Iraqi, and I'm wondering if some of it is very racist against Palestinians and Muslims, but
Yes.
I'm curious how you see that.
So this is super helpful. Yes, they do. They have been feeling disconnected from their culture, and the past 10 years have seen a bit of a shift. And some of the beginning of my paper was part of another paper I'm writing that ends up on the Karkabi note.
Yeah.
So what I started with about Zionism being a bridge, and specifically a translating bridge, that commodifies, and this is something I didn't linger on here, that commodifies the East for the West, that makes the East legible, makes sound bites out of it so that it's more marketable. This is something I wrote before the war, and that I don't know what to do with it right now because it's just like, it's a whole other thing. But that is happening in Israel at the moment, where Middle Easternists, again, before the war, for the past 10 years, has started to be celebrated, but only as those empty, commodified sound bites. So Karkabi has an essay with Oded Erez on the use of Arabic in popular music in Israel. And they have a tripartite division that I find really useful. They look at Israeli popular, Mizrahi artists, popular music artists. The first kind are ones who are performing in Arabic and actually understand Arabic and are even singing the songs that their grandfather and great uncle sang in Iraq, who were famous musicians there. So that's one example. People who are actually engaging with Arabic music in a meaningful way. There are very few. Let's start there. The second kind is Ewa, is Israelis of a third and fourth generation who are, again, leaning into their families, in this case, Yemeni heritage, don't understand any word of the music they're singing, marketing amazingly. I've heard from students that in LA parties, AOA is going strong. So in that case, they're singing songs that are in Arabic. They don't understand a word. It's all, the clips are very beautifully photographed, and the dance music is great. So again, marketing is definitely here. And then the third kind is way more common in Israel, and that's about using Arabic as style. So it's a word of Arabic here or there. It's accent, shafita. It's just using Arabic accent to make things more oriental. For me, it's there's a club night called Arisa, which is a gay men, weekly club night for Mizrahi men that is kind of about, it's a form of pinkwashing, advancing Arab bodies that are deprived of Arabness, so they're not that dangerous. And there's a whole tourism industry, not since the war, built around, there's a gay tourism to Israel, but built around this Arab Jewish bodies that are Arab without the danger of actual Arabness. And that is what is marketed. It's amazing. You can go on those websites for gay tourism to Israel and see brown bodies being kind of... So there has been a shift in that sense, but I really don't think it's a genuine acceptance of Middle Eastern culture, Mizrahi or Palestinian or any. You see it with food too, obviously. Yeah. It's more about marketing or this kind of translation of the East for the West. Israeli cuisine in New York is a great example of that stuff. Yeah, just putting it out there. Thank you.
In Toronto too.
Oh, yeah?
Hey, thank you so much. Because you mentioned Albert Memmi, I want to ask a question about North Africa. I was wondering about how important the settler colonialism in Algeria and North Africa in general, how important it is to this Mizrahi imagination. And because in North Africa, Jews were indigenous, but then they were either embracing a settler subjectivity or made to embrace a settler subjectivity. And so can their story help us understand Ben Kiki, for example, a little better? And how important is that other story of settler colonialism?
So the Algerian case is a little bit exceptional, as much as I don't love this word, in a few ways, including the Gremieux edict that made Jews French citizens already in the 19th century, but also because most Jews in Algeria did not migrate to Israel, they migrated to France. So there are very few Algerian Jews in Israel itself. And so to compare that to Ben Kiki or any of the other figures I talk about, it's difficult just because there are not many. And I think the question, a better question would be France, which is beyond my expertise. But I do think something very interesting is happening with Algerian Jews and Algerian Muslims in France, and the way that France has its own anti-Semitism, good Oriental, bad Oriental going on with Jews versus Muslims. And they're doing it. What's his name? God, there's a Jewish Algerian. Yes, exactly. You see what I mean? Yeah, but that's just not my. It's just not my field.
It's between those two columns.
Yes.
Just in the U.S.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
So we have maybe time for one more question, or if there's a couple that are quick.
Thank you for the very informative talk about just the history of specifically Jewish iterations of anti-Zionism. I'm going to focus my question on Ben Kiki just because what I find interesting about him is you mentioned that he was a rabbi by training, right?
I did not.
Did you?
First of all, he was.
I see.
I don't think so.
I do recall that because I saw his name in like an edited volume before, and I think he did have like a more of a religious training. And I think something that you brought up that's interesting is his engagement with Zionists specifically in Europe, but from the position of like a Jewish Palestinian. And so I wonder if perhaps he was coming from a position of like a religious Jew at the time, and if so, maybe do you mind speaking a bit more on how that sort of positionality informs his critiques of Zionism, but also if you bracket the identity part a bit, how that informs his critique of like a liberal cosmopolitanism that's embedded within Zionism?
Great question. So, first of all, everyone, when he was a child, all Jews in Palestine went to a religious school in the sense that that was the school. But also, religion and secularism are not applicable terms to what was going on. So he wasn't a religious person. He was a Jewish person, whatever that meant in early 20th century Palestine, or to my grandparents for that matter. Like, it's not such a long, like my dad is not going to understand your like religious secular thing. Like, they're doing what they're doing because that's what they're doing. They're doing it. So he wasn't religious in the way that we would think about it. And this avoidance of categories is also in the way that he writes. So he's not criticizing anything in the name of Jewish religion, or of identities at all. His writing is actually sometimes really hard to understand because he's never naming identities. He's talking about we's that are different we's in different contexts. So sometimes he says, we come to this land and do blah, blah, blah. But actually he doesn't mean him. He means Zionists. So we Zionists, but he's actually criticizing those Zionists who come to this land. He didn't come to this land. So he's saying we to mean Jews, but sometimes he says we, the people of the land. And, you know, like he's rarely saying Jews or Arabs or anything. Like he talks about building trust. He never mentions between whom and whom. So I think partly it's because it was obvious. Partly it's because it was the way that people talked at the time. But partly it's because he's not thinking in those identity categories that we are. And he's actually trying to avoid them as much as he can.
Great. That was really a wonderful session. Darryl, when you see this, thank you so much. We have so many questions for you. Yeah, we'll tweet them at you. You can find Darryl on Twitter and ask him your questions. Please join me in thanking Liron and Darryl for these wonderful sessions.